Chapter 13. Condemned to torture and death. Lay had followed her company, and when she saw them clawing and biting at Tarzan, she raised her voice and cautioned them not to kill him. She saw that he was weakening and that soon the greater numbers would prevail over him, nor had she long to wait before the mighty jungle creature lay helpless and bound at her feet. "Bring him to the place at which we stopped," she commanded, and they carried Tarzan back to the little clearing and threw him down beneath a tree. "Build me a shelter," ordered L.A. "We shall stop here tonight, and tomorrow, in the face of the flaming god, La will offer up the heart of this defiler of the temple. Where is the sacred knife? Who took it from him?" But no one had seen it, and each was positive in his assurance that the sacrificial weapon had not been upon Tarzan's person when they captured him. The ape-man looked upon the menacing creatures which surrounded him and snarled his defiance. He looked upon Lay and smiled. In the face of death he was unafraid. "Where is the knife?" La asked him. "I do not know," replied Tarzan. "The man took it with him when he slipped away during the night. Since you are so desirous for its return, I would look for him and get it back for you. Did you not hold me prisoner? But now that I am to die, I cannot get it back. Of what good was your knife? Anyway, you can make another. Did you follow us all this way for nothing more than a knife? Let me go and find him, and I will bring it back to you." La laughed a bitter laugh, for in her heart she knew that Tarzan's sin was greater than the purloining of the sacrificial knife of Opar. Yet as she looked at him lying bound and helpless before her, tears rose to her eyes so that she had to turn away to hide them. But she remained inflexible in her determination to make him pay in frightful suffering and in eventual death for daring to spurn the love of Lay. When the shelter was completed, La had Tarzan transferred to it. "All night I shall torture him," she muttered to her priests, "and at the first streak of dawn you may prepare the flaming altar upon which his heart shall be offered up to the flaming god. Gather wood well filled with pitch. Lay it in the form and size of the altar at Opar in the center of the clearing, that the flaming god may look down upon our handiwork and be pleased." During the balance of the day, the priests of Opar were busy erecting an altar in the center of the clearing, and while they worked they chanted weird hymns in the ancient tongue of that lost continent that lies at the bottom of the Atlantic. They knew not the meanings of the words they mouthed, but repeated the ritual that had been handed down from preceptor to neophyte since that long-gone day when the ancestors of the Piltdown Man still swung by their tails in the humid jungles that are England now. And in the shelter of the hut, La paced to and fro beside the stoic ape-man. Resigned to his fate was Tarzan. No hope of succor gleamed through the dead black of the death sentence hanging over him. He knew that his giant muscles could not part the many strands that bound his wrists and ankles, for he had strained often but ineffectually for release. He had no hope of outside help, and only enemies surrounded him within the camp, and yet he smiled at Leia as she paced nervously back and forth the length of the shelter. And L.A. She fingered her knife and looked down upon her captive. She glared and muttered, but she did not strike. "Tonight," she thought, "tonight, when it is dark, I will torture him." She looked upon his perfect, godlike figure and upon his handsome, smiling face, and then she steeled her heart again by thoughts of her love spurned by religious thoughts that damned the infidel who had desecrated the Holy of Holies, who had taken from the blood-stained altar of Opar the offering to the flaming god, and not once but thrice. 3 times had Tarzan cheated the god of her fathers. At the thought, Ella paused and knelt at his side. In her hand was a sharp knife. She placed its point against the ape-man's side and pressed upon the hilt, but Tarzan only smiled and shrugged his shoulders. How beautiful he was! La bent low over him, looking into his eyes. How perfect was his figure! She compared it with those of the gnarled and knotted men from whom she must choose a mate, and La shuddered at the thought. Dusk came, and after dusk came night. A great fire blazed within the little thorn boma about the camp. The flames played upon the new altar erected in the center of the clearing, arousing in the mind of the high priestess of the flaming god a picture of the event of the coming dawn. She saw this giant and perfect form writhing amid the flames of the burning pyre. She saw those smiling lips, burned and blackened, falling away from the strong white teeth. She saw the shock of black hair tousled upon Tarzan's well-shaped head disappear in a spurt of flame. She saw these and many other frightful pictures as she stood with closed eyes and clenched fists above the object of her hate. Was it hate that Lay of Opar felt? The darkness of the jungle night had settled down upon the camp, relieved only by the fitful flarings of the fire that was kept up to warn off the man-eaters. Tarzan lay quietly in his bonds. He suffered from thirst and from the cutting of the tight strands about his wrists and ankles, but he made no complaint. A jungle beast was Tarzan with the stoicism of the beast and the intelligence of man. He knew that his doom was sealed, that no supplications would avail to temper the severity of his end, and so he wasted no breath in pleadings but waited patiently in the firm conviction that his sufferings could not endure forever. In the darkness La stooped above him. In her hand was a sharp knife, and in her mind the determination to initiate his torture without further delay. The knife was pressed against his side, and La's face was close to his when a sudden burst of flame from new branches thrown upon the fire without lighted up the interior of the shelter. Close beneath her lips La saw the perfect features of the forest god, and into her woman's heart welled all the great love she had felt for Tarzan since first she had seen him, and all the accumulated passion of the years that she had dreamed of him. Dagger in hand, La, the high priestess, towered above the helpless creature that had dared to violate the sanctuary of her deity. There should be no torture, there should be instant death. No longer should the defiler of the temple pollute the sight of the Lord God Almighty. A single stroke of the heavy blade, and then the corpse to the flaming pyre without. The knife arm stiffened, ready for the downward plunge, and then La, the woman, collapsed weakly upon the body of the man she loved. She ran her hands in mute caress over his naked flesh. She covered his forehead, his eyes, his lips with hot kisses. She covered him with her body as though to protect him from the hideous fate she had ordained for him, and in trembling, piteous tones she begged him for his love. For hours the frenzy of her passion possessed the burning hand maiden of the flaming god, until at last sleep overpowered her and she lapsed into unconsciousness beside the man she had sworn to torture and to slay. And Tarzan, untroubled by thoughts of the future, slept peacefully in La's embrace. At the first hint of dawn, the chanting of the priests of Opar brought Tarzan to wakefulness. Initiated in low and subdued tones, the sound soon rose in volume to the open diapason of barbaric bloodlust. Ella stirred. Her perfect arm pressed Tarzan closer to her. A smile parted her lips, and then she awoke, and slowly the smile faded and her eyes went wide in horror as the significance of the death chant impinged upon her understanding. "Love me, Tarzan," she cried. "Love me and you shall be saved." Tarzan's bonds hurt him. He was suffering the tortures of long-restricted circulation. With an angry growl, he rolled over with his back toward Lale. That was her answer. The high priestess leaped to her feet. A hot flush of shame mantled her cheek, and then she went dead white and stepped to the shelter's entrance. "Come, priests of the flaming god," she cried, "and make ready the sacrifice." The warped things advanced and entered the shelter. They laid hands upon Tarzan and bore him forth, and as they chanted they kept time with their crooked bodies, swaying to and fro to the rhythm of their song of blood and death. Behind them came La, swaying too, but not in unison with the chanted cadence. White and drawn was the face of the high priestess, white and drawn with unrequited love and hideous terror of the moments to come. Yet stern in her resolve was La. The infidel should die. The scorner of her love should pay the price upon the fiery altar. She saw them lay the perfect body there upon the rough branches. She saw the high priest, he to whom custom would unite her bent, crooked, gnarled, stunted, hideous advance with the flaming torch, and stand awaiting her command to apply it to the faggots surrounding the sacrificial pyre. His hairy, bestial face was distorted in a yellow-fanged grin of anticipatory enjoyment. His hands were cupped to receive the life-blood of the victim, the red nectar that at Opar would have filled the golden sacrificial goblets. Ella approached with upraised knife, her face turned toward the rising sun, and upon her lips a prayer to the burning deity of her people. The high priest looked questioningly toward her. The brand was burning close to his hand, and the faggots lay temptingly near. Tarzan closed his eyes and awaited the end. He knew that he would suffer, for he recalled the faint memories of past burns. He knew that he would suffer and die, but he did not flinch. Death is no great adventure to the jungle-bred who walk hand in hand with the grim spectre by day and lie down at his side by night through all the years of their lives. It is doubtful that the ape-man even speculated upon what came after death. As a matter of fact, as his end approached, his mind was occupied by thoughts of the pretty pebbles he had lost, yet his every faculty still was open to what passed around him. He felt La lean over him and he opened his eyes. He saw her white, drawn face and he saw tears blinding her eyes. "Tarzan, my Tarzan." She moaned, "Tell me that you love me, that you will return to Opar with me and you shall live. Even in the face of the anger of my people I will save you. This last chance I give you. What is your answer?" At the last moment, the woman in Lay had triumphed over the high priestess of a cruel cult. She saw upon the altar the only creature that ever had aroused the fires of love within her virgin breast. She saw the beast-faced fanatic who would one day be her mate, unless she found another less repulsive, standing with the burning torch ready to ignite the pyre. Yet, with all her mad passion for the ape-man, she would give the word to apply the flame if Tarzan's final answer was unsatisfactory. With heaving bosom, she leaned close above him. "Yes or no," she whispered. Through the jungle, out of the distance, came faintly a sound that brought a sudden light of hope to Tarzan's eyes. He raised his voice in a weird scream that sent Lay back from him a step or two. The impatient priest grumbled and switched the torch from one hand to the other at the same time, holding it closer to the tinder at the base of the pyre. "Your answer," insisted Lay. "What is your answer to the love of Jewels of Opar?" Closer came the sound that had attracted Tarzan's attention, and now the others heard it, the shrill trumpeting of an elephant. As Lay looked wide-eyed into Tarzan's face, there to read her fate for happiness or heartbreak, she saw an expression of concern shadow his features. Now, for the first time, she guessed the meaning of Tarzan's shrill scream. He had summoned Tantor, the elephant, to his rescue. Lay's brows contracted in a savage scowl. "You refuse, Lay," she cried. "Then die. The torch," she commanded, turning toward the priest. Tarzan looked up into her face. "Tantor is coming," he said. "I thought that he would rescue me, but I know now from his voice that he will slay me and you and all that fall in his path, searching out with the cunning of Sheeta, the panther, those who would hide from him, for Tantor is mad with the madness of love." Lay knew only too well the insane ferocity of a bull elephant in must. She knew that Tarzan had not exaggerated. She knew that the devil in the cunning, cruel brain of the great beast might send it hither and thither, hunting through the forest for those who escaped its first charge, or the beast might pass on without returning, no one might guess which. "I cannot love you," Lay said Tarzan in a low voice. "I do not know why, for you are very beautiful. I could not go back and live in Opar, I who have the whole broad jungle for my range. No. I cannot love you, but I cannot see you die beneath the goring tusks of mad Tantor. Cut my bonds before it is too late. Already he is almost upon us. Cut them and I may yet save you." A little spiral of curling smoke rose from one corner of the pyre. The flames licked upward, crackling. Lass stood there like a beautiful statue of despair, gazing at Tarzan and at the spreading flames. In a moment they would reach out and grasp him. From the tangled forest came the sound of cracking limbs and crashing trunks. Tantor was coming down upon them, a huge juggernaut of the jungle. The priests were becoming uneasy. They cast apprehensive glances in the direction of the approaching elephant and then back at Lay. "Fly," she commanded them, and then she stooped and cut the bonds, securing her prisoner's feet and hands. In an instant Tarzan was upon the ground. The priests screamed out their rage and disappointment. He with the torch took a menacing step toward Lay and the ape-man. "Traitor," he shrieked at the woman. "For this you too shall die." Raising his bludgeon, he rushed upon the high priestess, but Tarzan was there before her. Leaping into close quarters, the ape-man seized the upraised weapon and wrenched it from the hands of the frenzied fanatic, and then the priest closed upon him with tooth and nail. Seizing the stocky, stunted body in his mighty hands, Tarzan raised the creature high above his head, hurling him at his fellows who were now gathered ready to bear down upon their erstwhile captive. Lass stood proudly with ready knife behind the ape-man. No faint sign of fear marked her perfect brow, only haughty disdain for her priests and admiration for the man she loved so hopelessly filled her thoughts. Suddenly upon this scene burst the mad bull, a huge tusker, his little eyes inflamed with insane rage. The priests stood for an instant paralyzed with terror, but Tarzan turned and, gathering Lay in his arms, raced for the nearest tree. Tantor bore down upon him, trumpeting shrilly. Lay clung with both white arms about the ape-man's neck. She felt him leap into the air and marveled at his strength and his ability as, burdened with her weight, he swung nimbly into the lower branches of a large tree and quickly bore her upward beyond reach of the sinuous trunk of the pachyderm. Momentarily baffled here, the huge elephant wheeled and bore down upon the hapless priests who had now scattered, terror-stricken, in every direction. The nearest he gored and threw high among the branches of a tree. One he seized in the coils of his trunk and broke upon a huge bole, dropping the mangled pulp to charge, trumpeting after another. Two he trampled beneath his huge feet, and by then the others had disappeared into the jungle. Now Tantor turned his attention once more to Tarzan, for one of the symptoms of madness is a revulsion of affection. Objects of sane love become the objects of insane hatred. Peculiar in the unwritten annals of the jungle was the proverbial love that had existed between the ape-man and the tribe of Tantor. No elephant in all the jungle would harm the Tarmangani, the white ape, but with the madness of must upon him, the great bull sought to destroy his long-time playfellow. Back to the tree where La and Tarzan perched came Tantor, the elephant. He reared up with his forefeet against the bole and reached high toward them with his long trunk, but Tarzan had foreseen this and clambered beyond the bull's longest reach. Failure but tended to further enrage the mad creature. He bellowed and trumpeted and screamed until the earth shook to the mighty volume of his noise. He put his head against the tree and pushed, and the tree bent before his mighty strength, yet still it held. The actions of Tarzan were peculiar in the extreme. Had Numa or Sabor or Cheetah or any other beast of the jungle been seeking to destroy him, the ape-man would have danced about hurling missiles and invectives at his assailant. He would have insulted and taunted them, reviling in the jungle Billingsgate he knew so well, but now he sat silent out of Tantor's reach, and upon his handsome face was an expression of deep sorrow and pity, for of all the jungle folk Tarzan loved Tantor the best. Could he have slain him, he would not have thought of doing so. His one idea was to escape, for he knew that with the passing of the musk Tantor would be sane again, and that once more he might stretch at full length upon that mighty back and make foolish speech into those great, flapping ears. Finding that the tree would not fall to his pushing, Tantor was but enraged the more. He looked up at the two perched high above him, his red-rimmed eyes blazing with insane hatred, and then he wound his trunk about the bole of the tree, spread his giant feet wide apart, and tugged to uproot the jungle giant. A huge creature was Tantor, an enormous bull in the full prime of all his stupendous strength. Mightily he strove until presently, to Tarzan's consternation, the great tree gave slowly at the roots. The ground rose in little mounds and ridges about the base of the bole. The tree tilted. In another moment it would be uprooted and fall. The ape-man whirled Lai to his back, and just as the tree inclined slowly in its first movement out of the perpendicular, before the sudden rush of its final collapse, he swung to the branches of a lesser neighbor. It was a long and perilous leap. La closed her eyes and shuddered, but when she opened them again she found herself safe and Tarzan whirling onward through the forest. Behind them the uprooted tree crashed heavily to the ground, carrying with it the lesser trees in its path, and then Tantor, realizing that his prey had escaped him, set up once more his hideous trumpeting and followed at a rapid charge upon their trail. Chapter 14. A priestess, but yet a woman. At first La closed her eyes and clung to Tarzan in terror, though she made no outcry, but presently she gained sufficient courage to look about her, to look down at the ground beneath, and even to keep her eyes open during the wide perilous swings from tree to tree. And then there came over her a sense of safety because of her confidence in the perfect physical creature in whose strength and nerve and agility her fate lay. Once she raised her eyes to the burning sun and murmured a prayer of thanks to her pagan god that she had not been permitted to destroy this godlike man, and her long lashes were wet with tears. A strange anomaly was Jewels of Opar, a creature of circumstance torn by conflicting emotions. Now the cruel and bloodthirsty creature of a heartless god, and again a melting woman filled with compassion and tenderness. Sometimes the incarnation of jealousy and revenge, and sometimes a sobbing maiden, generous and forgiving at once, a virgin and a wanton, but always a woman. Such was L.A. She pressed her cheek close to Tarzan's shoulder. Slowly she turned her head until her hot lips were pressed against his flesh. She loved him, and would gladly have died for him, yet within an hour she had been ready to plunge a knife into his heart, and might again within the coming hour. A hapless priest seeking shelter in the jungle chanced to show himself to enraged Tantor. The great beast turned to one side, bore down upon the crooked little man, snuffed him out, and then, diverted from his course, blundered away toward the south. In a few minutes even the noise of his trumpeting was lost in the distance. Tarzan dropped to the ground and La slipped to her feet from his back. "Call your people together," said Tarzan. "They will kill me," replied La. "They will not kill you," contradicted the ape-man. "No one will kill you while Tarzan of the Apes is here. Call them and we will talk with them." La raised her voice in a weird, flute-like call that carried far into the jungle on every side. From near and far came answering shouts in the barking tones of the Oparian priests, "We come, we come." Again and again La repeated her summons until singly and in pairs the greater portion of her following approached and halted a short distance away from the high priestess and her savior. They came with scowling brows and threatening mien. When all had come, Tarzan addressed them. Your Louisiana is safe, said the ape-man. Had she slain me, she would now herself be dead and many more of you, but she spared me that I might save her. Go your way with her back to Opar, and Tarzan will go his way into the jungle. Let there be peace always between Tarzan and L.A. What is your answer? The priests grumbled and shook their heads. They spoke together, and L.A. and Tarzan could see that they were not favorably inclined toward the proposition. They did not wish to take La back, and they did wish to complete the sacrifice of Tarzan to the flaming god. At last the ape-man became impatient. You will obey the commands of your queen, he said, and go back to Opar with her, or Tarzan of the Apes will call together the other creatures of the jungle and slay you all. Lay saved me that I might save you and her. I have served you better alive than I could have dead. If you are not all fools, you will let me go my way in peace, and you will return to Opar with L.A. I know not where the sacred knife is, but you can fashion another. Had I not taken it from Lay, you would have slain me, and now your god must be glad that I took it, since I have saved his priestess from love, mad Tantor. Will you go back to Opar with L.A., promising that no harm shall befall her? The priests gathered together in a little knot, arguing and discussing. They pounded upon their breasts with their fists, they raised their hands and eyes to their fiery god, they growled and barked among themselves until it became evident to Tarzan that one of their number was preventing the acceptance of his proposal. This was the high priest, whose heart was filled with jealous rage because Lea openly acknowledged her love for the stranger, when by the worldly customs of their cult she should have belonged to him. Seemingly there was to be no solution of the problem until another priest stepped forth and, raising his hand, addressed L.A. Kajay, the high priest, he announced, would sacrifice you both to the flaming god, but all of us except Kajay would gladly return to Opar with our queen. You are many against one, spoke up Tarzan. Why should you not have your will? Go your way with Lay to Opar, and if Kajay interferes, slay him. The priests of Opar welcomed this suggestion with loud cries of approval. To them it appeared nothing short of divine inspiration. The influence of ages of unquestioning obedience to high priests had made it seem impossible to them to question his authority, but when they realized that they could force him to their will, they were as happy as children with new toys. They rushed forward and seized Kajay. They talked in loud, menacing tones into his ear. They threatened him with bludgeon and knife until at last he acquiesced in their demands, though sullenly, and then Tarzan stepped close before Kajay. Priest, he said, Lay goes back to her temple under the protection of her priests and the threat of Tarzan of the Apes that whoever harms her shall die. Tarzan will go again to Opar before the next rains, and if harm has befallen L.A., woe betide Kajay, the high priest. Sullenly Kajay promised not to harm his queen. Protect her, cried Tarzan to the other Oparians. Protect her, so that when Tarzan comes again, he will find Lay there to greet him. L.A. will be there to greet thee, exclaimed the high priestess, and La will wait, longing, always longing, until you come again. Oh, tell me that you will come. Who knows, asked the ape-man as he swung quickly into the trees and raced off toward the east. For a moment La stood looking after him, then her head drooped, a sigh escaped her lips, and like an old woman she took up the march toward distant Opar. Through the trees raced Tarzan of the Apes until the darkness of night had settled upon the jungle. Then he lay down and slept, with no thought beyond the morrow, and with even lay but the shadow of a memory within his consciousness. But a few marches to the north, Lady Greystoke looked forward to the day when her mighty lord and master should discover the crime of Achmet Zeke and be speeding to rescue and avenge, and even as she pictured the coming of John Clayton, the object of her thoughts squatted almost naked beside a fallen log, beneath which he was searching with grimy fingers for a chance beetle or a luscious grub. 2 days elapsed following the theft of the jewels before Tarzan gave them a thought. Then, as they chanced to enter his mind, he conceived a desire to play with them again, and having nothing better to do than satisfy the first whim which possessed him, he rose and started across the plain from the forest in which he had spent the preceding day. Though no marks showed where the gems had been buried, and though the spot resembled the balance of an unbroken stretch several miles in length, where the reeds terminated at the edge of the meadowland, yet the ape-man moved with unerring precision directly to the place where he had hid his treasure. With his hunting knife he upturned the loose earth, beneath which the pouch should be, but, though he excavated to a greater distance than the depth of the original hole, there was no sign of pouch or jewels. Tarzan's brow clouded as he discovered that he had been despoiled. Little or no reasoning was required to convince him of the identity of the guilty party, and with the same celerity that had marked his decision to unearth the jewels, he set out upon the trail of the thief. Though the spoor was 2 days old and practically obliterated in many places, Tarzan followed it with comparative ease. A white man could not have followed it 20 paces 12 hours after it had been made. A black man would have lost it within the first mile, but Tarzan of the Apes had been forced in childhood to develop senses that an ordinary mortal scarce ever uses. We may note the garlic and whiskey on the breath of a fellow strap hanger, or the cheap perfume emanating from the person of the wondrous lady sitting in front of us, and deplore the fact of our sensitive noses, but, as a matter of fact, we cannot smell at all. Our olfactory organs are practically atrophied by comparison with the development of the sense among the beasts of the wild. Where a foot is placed, an effluvium remains for a considerable time. It is beyond the range of our sensibilities, but to a creature of the lower orders, especially to the hunters and the hunted, as interesting and ofttimes more lucid than is the printed page to us. Nor was Tarzan dependent alone upon his sense of smell. Vision and hearing had been brought to a marvelous state of development by the necessities of his early life, where survival itself depended almost daily upon the exercise of the keenest vigilance and the constant use of all his faculties. And so he followed the old trail of the Belgian through the forest and toward the north, but because of the age of the trail he was constrained to a far from rapid progress. The man he followed was 2 days ahead of him when Tarzan took up the pursuit, and each day he gained upon the ape-man. The latter, however, felt not the slightest doubt as to the outcome. Some day he would overhaul his quarry. He could bide his time in peace until that day dawned. Doggedly he followed the faint spoor, pausing by day only to kill and eat, and at night only to sleep and refresh himself. Occasionally he passed parties of savage warriors, but these he gave a wide berth, for he was hunting with a purpose that was not to be distracted by the minor accidents of the trail. These parties were of the collecting hordes of the Waziri and their allies, which Bazuli had scattered his messengers broadcast to summon. They were marching to a common rendezvous in preparation for an assault upon the stronghold of Ahmedzek, but to Tarzan they were enemies. He retained no conscious memory of any friendship for the black men. It was night when he halted outside the palisaded village of the Arab raider. Perched in the branches of a great tree, he gazed down upon the life within the enclosure. To this place had the spoor led him. His quarry must be within, but how was he to find him among so many huts? Tarzan, although cognizant of his mighty powers, realized also his limitations. He knew that he could not successfully cope with great numbers in open battle. He must resort to the stealth and trickery of the wild beast, if he were to succeed. Sitting in the safety of his tree, munching upon the leg bone of Horta, the boar, Tarzan waited a favorable opportunity to enter the village. For a while he gnawed at the bulging, round ends of the large bone, splintering off small pieces between his strong jaws, and sucking at the delicious marrow within, but all the time he cast repeated glances into the village. He saw white-robed figures, and half-naked blacks, but not once did he see one who resembled the stealer of the gems. Patiently he waited until the streets were deserted by all save the sentries at the gates. Then he dropped lightly to the ground, circled to the opposite side of the village, and approached the palisade. At his side hung a long rawhide rope, a natural and more dependable evolution from the grass rope of his childhood. Loosening this, he spread the noose upon the ground behind him, and with a quick movement of his wrist tossed the coils over one of the sharpened projections of the summit of the palisade. Drawing the noose taut, he tested the solidity of its hold. Satisfied, the ape-man ran nimbly up the vertical wall, aided by the rope which he clutched in both hands. Once at the top, it required but a moment to gather the dangling rope once more into its coils, make it fast again at his waist, take a quick glance downward within the palisade, and assured that no one lurked directly beneath him, drop softly to the ground. Now he was within the village. Before him stretched a series of tents and native huts. The business of exploring each of them would be fraught with danger, but danger was only a natural factor of each day's life. It never appalled Tarzan. The chances appealed to him, the chances of life and death, with his prowess and his faculties pitted against those of a worthy antagonist. It was not necessary that he enter each habitation through a door, a window, or an open chink. His nose told him whether or not his prey lay within. For some time he found one disappointment following upon the heels of another in quick succession. No spoor of the Belgian was discernible, but at last he came to a tent where the smell of the thief was strong. Tarzan listened, his ear close to the canvas at the rear, but no sound came from within. At last he cut one of the pin ropes, raised the bottom of the canvas, and intruded his head within the interior. All was quiet and dark. Tarzan crawled cautiously within. The scent of the Belgian was strong, but it was not live scent. Even before he had examined the interior minutely, Tarzan knew that no one was within it. In one corner he found a pile of blankets and clothing scattered about, but no pouch of pretty pebbles. A careful examination of the balance of the tent revealed nothing more, at least nothing to indicate the presence of the jewels, but at the side where the blankets and clothing lay, the ape-man discovered that the tent wall had been loosened at the bottom. And presently he sensed that the Belgian had recently passed out of the tent by this avenue. Tarzan was not long in following the way that his prey had fled. The spoor led always in the shadow, and at the rear of the huts and tents of the village it was quite evident to Tarzan that the Belgian had gone alone and secretly upon his mission. Evidently he feared the inhabitants of the village, or at least his work had been of such a nature that he dared not risk detection. At the back of a native hut the spoor led through a small hole, recently cut in the brush wall, and into the dark interior beyond. Fearlessly Tarzan followed the trail. On hands and knees he crawled through the small aperture. Within the hut his nostrils were assailed by many odors, but clear and distinct among them was one that half aroused a latent memory of the past. It was the faint and delicate odor of a woman. With the cognizance of it there rose in the breast of the ape-man a strange uneasiness, the result of an irresistible force which he was destined to become acquainted with anew, the instinct which draws the male to his mate. In the same hut was the scent spoor of the Belgian too, and as both these assailed the nostrils of the ape-man, mingling one with the other, a jealous rage leapt and burned within him, though his memory held before the mirror of recollection no image of the she to which he had attached his desire. Like the tent he had investigated, the hut too was empty, and after satisfying himself that his stolen pouch was secreted nowhere within, he left, as he had entered, by the hole in the rear wall. Here he took up the spoor of the Belgian, followed it across the clearing, over the palisade, and out into the dark jungle beyond. Chapter 15. The Flight of Werper. After Werper had arranged the dummy in his bed and sneaked out into the darkness of the village beneath the rear wall of his tent, he had gone directly to the hut in which Jane Clayton was held captive. Before the doorway squatted a black sentry. Werper approached him boldly, spoke a few words in his ear, handed him a package of tobacco, and passed into the hut. The black grinned and winked as the European disappeared within the darkness of the interior. The Belgian, being one of Ahmed Zik's principal lieutenants, might naturally go where he wished within or without the village, and so the sentry had not questioned his right to enter the hut with the white woman prisoner. Within, Werper called in French, and in a low whisper, "Lady Greystoke, it is I am Fricoult. Where are you?" But there was no response. Hastily the man felt around the interior, groping blindly through the darkness with outstretched hands. There was no one within. Werper's astonishment surpassed words. He was on the point of stepping without to question the sentry, when his eyes, becoming accustomed to the dark, discovered a blotch of lesser blackness near the base of the rear wall of the hut. Examination revealed the fact that the blotch was an opening cut in the wall. It was large enough to permit the passage of his body, and assured as he was that Lady Greystoke had passed out through the aperture in an attempt to escape the village, he lost no time in availing himself of the same avenue, but neither did he lose time in a fruitless search for Jane Clayton. His own life depended upon the chance of his eluding or outdistancing Ahmed Zik when that worthy should have discovered that he had escaped. His original plan had contemplated connivance in the escape of Lady Greystoke for two very good and sufficient reasons. The first was that by saving her he would win the gratitude of the English, and thus lessen the chance of his extradition should his identity and his crime against his superior officer be charged against him. The second reason was based upon the fact that only one direction of escape was safely open to him. He could not travel to the west because of the Belgian possessions which lay between him and the Atlantic. The south was closed to him by the feared presence of the savage ape-man he had robbed. To the north lay the friends and allies of Ahmed Zik. Only toward the east, through British East Africa, lay reasonable assurance of freedom. Accompanied by a titled Englishwoman whom he had rescued from a frightful fate, and his identity vouched for by her as that of a Frenchman by the name of Fricoult, he had looked forward, and not without reason, to the active assistance of the British from the moment that he came in contact with their first outpost. But now that Lady Greystoke had disappeared, though he still looked toward the east for hope, his chances were lessened, and another, subsidiary design completely dashed. From the moment that he had first laid eyes upon Jane Clayton, he had nursed within his breast a secret passion for the beautiful American wife of the English lord, and when Ahmed Zik's discovery of the jewels had necessitated flight, The Belgian had dreamed, in his planning, of a future in which he might convince Lady Greystoke that her husband was dead, and by playing upon her gratitude win her for himself. At that part of the village farthest from the gates, Werper discovered that 2 or 3 long poles, taken from a nearby pile which had been collected for the construction of huts, had been leaned against the top of the palisade, forming a precarious though not impossible avenue of escape. Rightly he inferred that thus had Lady Greystoke found the means to scale the wall, nor did he lose even a moment in following her lead. Once in the jungle he struck out directly eastward. A few miles south of him, Jane Clayton lay panting among the branches of a tree in which she had taken refuge from a prowling and hungry lioness. Her escape from the village had been much easier than she had anticipated. The knife which she had used to cut her way through the brush wall of the hut to freedom she had found sticking in the wall of her prison, doubtless left there by accident when a former tenant had vacated the premises. To cross the rear of the village, keeping always in the densest shadows, had required but a few moments, and the fortunate circumstance of the discovery of the hut poles lying so near the palisade had solved for her the problem of the passage of the high wall. For an hour she had followed the old game trail toward the south, until there fell upon her trained hearing the stealthy padding of a stalking beast behind her. The nearest tree gave her instant sanctuary, for she was too wise in the ways of the jungle to chance her safety for a moment after discovering that she was being hunted. Werper, with better success, travelled slowly onward until dawn when, to his chagrin, he discovered a mounted Arab upon his trail. It was one of Achmet Zek's minions, many of whom were scattered in all directions through the forest, searching for the fugitive Belgian. Jane Clayton's escape had not yet been discovered when Achmet Zek and his searchers set forth to overhaul Werper. The only man who had seen the Belgian after his departure from his tent was the black sentry before the doorway of Lady Greystoke's prison hut, and he had been silenced by the discovery of the dead body of the man who had relieved him, the sentry that Mugambi had dispatched. The bribe-taker naturally inferred that Werper had slain his fellow and dared not admit that he had permitted him to enter the hut, fearing as he did the anger of Achmet Zek. So as chance directed that he should be the one to discover the body of the sentry when the first alarm had been given following Achmet Zek's discovery that Werper had outwitted him, the crafty black had dragged the dead body to the interior of a nearby tent, and himself resumed his station before the doorway of the hut in which he still believed the woman to be. With the discovery of the Arab close behind him, the Belgian hid in the foliage of a leafy bush. Here the trail ran straight for a considerable distance, and down the shady forest aisle, beneath the overarching branches of the trees, rode the white-robed figure of the pursuer. Nearer and nearer he came. Werper crouched closer to the ground behind the leaves of his hiding place. Across the trail a vine moved. Werper's eyes instantly centered upon the spot. There was no wind to stir the foliage in the depths of the jungle. Again the vine moved. In the mind of the Belgian, only the presence of a sinister and malevolent force could account for the phenomenon. The man's eyes bored steadily into the screen of leaves upon the opposite side of the trail. Gradually a form took shape beyond them, a tawny form, grim and terrible, with yellow-green eyes glaring fearsomely across the narrow trail straight into his. Werper could have screamed in fright, but up the trail was coming the messenger of another death, equally sure and no less terrible. He remained silent, almost paralyzed by fear. The Arab approached. Across the trail from Werper the lion crouched for the spring, when suddenly his attention was attracted toward the horseman. The Belgian saw the massive head turn in the direction of the raider, and his heart all but ceased its beating as he awaited the result of this interruption. At a walk the horseman approached. Would the nervous animal he rode take fright at the odor of the carnivore, and bolting, leave Werper still to the mercies of the king of beasts? But he seemed unmindful of the near presence of the great cat. On he came, his neck arched, champing at the bit between his teeth. The Belgian turned his eyes again toward the lion. The beast's whole attention now seemed riveted upon the horseman. They were abreast the lion now, and still the brute did not spring. Could he be but waiting for them to pass before returning his attention to the original prey? Werper shuddered and half rose. At the same instant the lion sprang from his place of concealment, full upon the mounted man. The horse, with a shrill neigh of terror, shrank sideways almost upon the Belgian. The lion dragged the helpless Arab from his saddle, and the horse leapt back into the trail and fled away toward the west. But he did not flee alone. As the frightened beast had pressed in upon him, Werper had not been slow to note the quickly emptied saddle and the opportunity it presented. Scarcely had the lion dragged the Arab down from one side, Then the Belgian, seizing the pommel of the saddle and the horse's mane, leaped upon the horse's back from the other. A half-hour later, a naked giant, swinging easily through the lower branches of the trees, paused, and with raised head and dilating nostrils sniffed the morning air. The smell of blood fell strong upon his senses, and mingled with it was the scent of Numa, the lion. The giant cocked his head upon one side and listened. From a short distance up the trail came the unmistakable noises of the greedy feeding of a lion. The crunching of bones, the gulping of great pieces, the contented growling, all attested the nearness of the king at table. Tarzan approached the spot, still keeping to the branches of the trees. He made no effort to conceal his approach, and presently he had evidence that Numa had heard him, from the ominous, rumbling warning that broke from a thicket beside the trail. Halting upon a low branch just above the lion, Tarzan looked down upon the grisly scene. Could this unrecognizable thing be the man he had been trailing? The ape-man wondered. From time to time he had descended to the trail and verified his judgment by the evidence of his scent that the Belgian had followed this game trail toward the east. Now he proceeded beyond the lion and his feast, again descended and examined the ground with his nose. There was no scent spoor here of the man he had been trailing. Tarzan returned to the tree. With keen eyes he searched the ground about the mutilated corpse for a sign of the missing pouch of pretty pebbles, but naught could he see of it. He scolded Numa and tried to drive the great beast away, but only angry growls rewarded his efforts. He tore small branches from a nearby limb and hurled them at his ancient enemy. Numa looked up with bared fangs, grinning hideously, but he did not rise from his kill. Then Tarzan fitted an arrow to his bow, and drawing the slim shaft far back, let drive with all the force of the tough wood that only he could bend. As the arrow sank deeply into his side, Numa leapt to his feet with a roar of mingled rage and pain. He leaped futilely at the grinning ape-man, tore at the protruding end of the shaft, and then, springing into the trail, paced back and forth beneath his tormentor. Again Tarzan loosed a swift bolt. This time the missile, aimed with care, lodged in the lion's spine. The great creature halted in its tracks, and lurched awkwardly forward upon its face, paralyzed. Tarzan dropped to the trail, ran quickly to the beast's side, and drove his spear deep into the fierce heart. Then, after recovering his arrows, turned his attention to the mutilated remains of the animal's prey in the nearby thicket. The face was gone. The Arab garments aroused no doubt as to the man's identity, since he had trailed him into the Arab camp and out again, where he might easily have acquired the apparel. So sure was Tarzan that the body was that of he who had robbed him that he made no effort to verify his deductions by scent among the conglomerate odors of the great carnivore and the fresh blood of the victim. He confined his attentions to a careful search for the pouch, but nowhere upon or about the corpse was any sign of the missing article or its contents. The ape-man was disappointed, possibly not so much because of the loss of the colored pebbles, as with Numa for robbing him of the pleasures of revenge. Wondering what could have become of his possessions, the ape-man turned slowly back along the trail in the direction from which he had come. In his mind he revolved a plan to enter and search the Arab camp, after darkness had again fallen. Taking to the trees, he moved directly south in search of prey, that he might satisfy his hunger before midday, and then lie up for the afternoon in some spot far from the camp, where he might sleep without fear of discovery until it came time to prosecute his design. Scarcely had he quitted the trail when a tall, black warrior, moving at a dogged trot, passed toward the east. It was Mugambi, searching for his mistress. He continued along the trail, halting to examine the body of the dead lion. An expression of puzzlement crossed his features as he bent to search for the wounds which had caused the death of the jungle lord. Tarzan had removed his arrows, but to Mugambi the proof of death was as strong as though both the lighter missiles and the spear still protruded from the carcass. The black looked furtively about him. The body was still warm, and from this fact he reasoned that the killer was close at hand, yet no sign of living man appeared. Mugambi shook his head and continued along the trail, but with redoubled caution. All day he travelled, stopping occasionally to call aloud the single word, "Lady," in the hope that at last she might hear and respond, but in the end his loyal devotion brought him to disaster. From the northeast for several months, Abdul Murak, in command of a detachment of Abyssinian soldiers, had been assiduously searching for the Arab raider Echmedzik, who 6 months previously had affronted the majesty of Abdul Murak's emperor by conducting a slave raid within the boundaries of Menelik's domain. And now it happened that Abdul Murak had halted for a short rest at noon upon this very day, and along the same trail that Werper and Mugambi were following toward the east. It was shortly after the soldiers had dismounted that the Belgian, unaware of their presence, rode his tired mount almost into their midst before he had discovered them. Instantly he was surrounded, and a volley of questions hurled at him as he was pulled from his horse and led toward the presence of the commander. Falling back upon his European nationality, Werper assured Abdul Murak that he was a Frenchman hunting in Africa, and that he had been attacked by strangers, his safari killed or scattered, and himself escaping only by a miracle. From a chance remark of the Abyssinian, Werper discovered the purpose of the expedition, and when he realized that these men were the enemies of Ahmed Zik, he took heart and immediately blamed his predicament upon the Arab. Lest, however, he might again fall into the hands of the raider, he discouraged Abdul Murak in the further prosecution of his pursuit, assuring the Abyssinian that Ahmed Zik commanded a large and dangerous force, and also that he was marching rapidly toward the south. Convinced that it would take a long time to overhaul the raider, and that the chances of engagement made the outcome extremely questionable, Murak, none too unwillingly, abandoned his plan and gave the necessary orders for his command to pitch camp where they were. Preparatory to taking up the return march toward Abyssinia the following morning. It was late in the afternoon that the attention of the camp was attracted toward the west by the sound of a powerful voice calling a single word repeated several times, "Lady, lady, lady, lady." True to their instincts of precaution, a number of Abyssinians, acting under orders from Abdul Murak, advanced stealthily through the jungle toward the author of the call. A half-hour later they returned, dragging Mugambi among them. The first person the big black's eyes fell upon as he was hustled into the presence of the Abyssinian officer was Jules Fricoul, the Frenchman who had been the guest of his master and whom he last had seen entering the village of Ahmed Zik under circumstances which pointed to his familiarity and friendship for the raiders. Between the disasters that had befallen his master and his master's house and the Frenchman, Mugambi saw a sinister relationship which kept him from recalling to Werper's attention the identity which the latter evidently failed to recognize. Pleading that he was but a harmless hunter from a tribe farther south, Mugambi begged to be allowed to go upon his way, but Abdul Murak, admiring the warrior's splendid physique, decided to take him back to Addis Ababa and present him to Menelik. A few moments later, Mugambi and Werper were marched away under guard, and the Belgian learned for the first time that he too was a prisoner rather than a guest. In vain he protested against such treatment, until a strapping soldier struck him across the mouth and threatened to shoot him if he did not desist. Mugambi took the matter less to heart, for he had not the slightest doubt but that during the course of the journey he would find ample opportunity to elude the vigilance of his guards and make good his escape. With this idea always uppermost in his mind, he courted the good opinion of the Abyssinians, asked them many questions about their emperor and their country, and evinced a growing desire to reach their destination, and that he might enjoy all the good things which they assured him the city of Addis Ababa contained. Thus he disarmed their suspicions, and each day found a slight relaxation of their watchfulness over him. By taking advantage of the fact that he and Werper always were kept together, Mugambi sought to learn what the other knew of the whereabouts of Tarzan, or the authorship of the raid upon the bungalow, as well as the fate of Lady Greystoke. But as he was confined to the accidents of conversation for this information, not daring to acquaint Werper with his true identity, and as Werper was equally anxious to conceal from the world his part in the destruction of his host's home and happiness, Mugambi learned nothing, at least in this way. But there came a time when he learned a very surprising thing by accident. The party had camped early in the afternoon of a sultry day, upon the banks of a clear and beautiful stream. The bottom of the river was gravelly. There was no indication of crocodiles, those menaces to promiscuous bathing in the rivers of certain portions of the dark continent, and so the Abyssinians took advantage of the opportunity to perform long-deferred and much-needed ablutions. As Werper, who, with Mugambi, had been given permission to enter the water, removed his clothing, the black noted the care with which he unfastened something which circled his waist, and which he took off with his shirt, keeping the latter always around and concealing the object of his suspicious solicitude. It was this very carefulness which attracted the black's attention to the thing, arousing a natural curiosity in the warrior's mind, and so it chanced that when the Belgian, in the nervousness of overcaution, fumbled the hidden article and dropped it, Mugambi saw it as it fell upon the ground, spilling a portion of its contents on the sward. Now Mugambi had been to London with his master. He was not the unsophisticated savage that his apparel proclaimed him, He had mingled with the cosmopolitan hordes of the greatest city in the world. He had visited museums and inspected shop windows, and besides, he was a shrewd and intelligent man. The instant that the jewels of Opar rolled, scintillating, before his astonished eyes, he recognized them for what they were, but he recognized something else too that interested him far more deeply than the value of the stones. 1,000 times he had seen the leathern pouch which dangled at his master's side when Tarzan of the Apes had, in a spirit of play and adventure, elected to return for a few hours to the primitive manners and customs of his boyhood, and surrounded by his naked warriors hunt the lion and the leopard, the buffalo and the elephant after the manner he loved best. Werper saw that Mugambi had seen the pouch and the stones. Hastily he gathered up the precious gems and returned them to their container, while Mugambi, assuming an air of indifference, strolled down to the river for his bath. The following morning Abdul Murak was enraged and chagrined to discover that his huge black prisoner had escaped during the night, while Werper was terrified for the same reason, until his trembling fingers discovered the pouch still in its place beneath his shirt, and within it the hard outlines of its contents. Chapter 16. Tarzan again leads the Mangani. Achmet Zek with 2 of his followers had circled far to the south to intercept the flight of his deserting lieutenant, Werper. Others had spread out in various directions so that a vast circle had been formed by them during the night, and now they were beating in toward the center. Achmet and the 2 with him halted for a short rest just before noon. They squatted beneath the trees upon the southern edge of a clearing. The chief of the raiders was in ill humor. To have been outwitted by an unbeliever was bad enough, but to have, at the same time, lost the jewels upon which he had set his avaricious heart was altogether too much. Allah must indeed be angry with his servant. While he still had the woman, she would bring a fair price in the north, and there was, too, the buried treasure beside the ruins of the Englishman's house. A slight noise in the jungle upon the opposite side of the clearing brought Achmet Zek to immediate and alert attention. He gathered his rifle in readiness for instant use, at the same time motioning his followers to silence and concealment. Crouching behind the bushes, the 3 waited, their eyes fastened upon the far side of the open space. Presently the foliage parted and a woman's face appeared, glancing fearfully from side to side. A moment later, evidently satisfied that no immediate danger lurked before her, she stepped out into the clearing in full view of the Arab. Achmet Zek caught his breath with a muttered exclamation of incredulity and an imprecation. The woman was the prisoner he had thought safely guarded at his camp. Apparently she was alone, but Achmet Zek waited that he might make sure of it before seizing her. Slowly Jane Clayton started across the clearing. Twice already since she had quitted the village of the raiders had she barely escaped the fangs of carnivora, and once she had almost stumbled into the path of one of the searchers. Though she was almost despairing of ever reaching safety, she still was determined to fight on, until death or success terminated her endeavors. As the Arabs watched her from the safety of their concealment, and Achmet Zek noted with satisfaction that she was walking directly into his clutches, another pair of eyes looked down upon the entire scene from the foliage of an adjacent tree. Puzzled, troubled eyes they were, for all their grey and savage glint, for their owner was struggling with an intangible suggestion of the familiarity of the face and figure of the woman below him. A sudden crashing of the bushes at the point from which Jane Clayton had emerged into the clearing brought her to a sudden stop and attracted the attention of the Arabs and the watcher in the tree to the same point. The woman wheeled about to see what new danger menaced her from behind, and as she did so a great anthropoid ape waddled into view. Behind him came another and another, but Lady Greystoke did not wait to learn how many more of the hideous creatures were so close upon her trail. With a smothered scream she rushed toward the opposite jungle, and as she reached the bushes there, Achmet Zek and his 2 henchmen rose up and seized her. At the same instant a naked, brown giant dropped from the branches of a tree at the right of the clearing. Turning toward the astonished apes, he gave voice to a short volley of low gutturals, and without waiting to note the effect of his words upon them, wheeled and charged for the Arabs. Achmet Zek was dragging Jane Clayton toward his tethered horse. His 2 men were hastily unfastening all 3 mounts. The woman, struggling to escape the Arab, turned and saw the ape-man running toward her. A glad light of hope illuminated her face. "John," she cried, "thank God that you have come in time." Behind Tarzan came the great apes, wondering but obedient to his summons. The Arabs saw that they would not have time to mount and make their escape before the beasts and the man were upon them. Achmet Zik recognized the latter as the redoubtable enemy of such as he, and he saw, too, in the circumstance an opportunity to rid himself forever of the menace of the ape-man's presence. Calling to his men to follow his example, he raised his rifle and leveled it upon the charging giant. His followers, acting with no less alacrity than himself, fired almost simultaneously, and with the reports of the rifles, Tarzan of the apes and two of his hairy henchmen pitched forward among the jungle grasses. The noise of the rifle shots brought the balance of the apes to a wondering pause, and taking advantage of their momentary distraction, Achmet Zik and his fellows leapt to their horses' backs and galloped away with the now hopeless and grief-stricken woman. Back to the village they rode, and once again Lady Greystoke found herself incarcerated in the filthy little hut from which she had thought to have escaped for good. But this time she was not only guarded by an additional sentry but bound as well. Singly and in twos the searchers who had ridden out with Achmet Zik upon the trail of the Belgian returned empty-handed. With the report of each the raider's rage and chagrin increased, until he was in such a transport of ferocious anger that none dared approach him. Threatening and cursing, Achmet Zik paced up and down the floor of his silken tent, but his temper served him naught. Werper was gone, and with him the fortune in scintillating gems which had aroused the cupidity of his chief, and placed the sentence of death upon the head of the lieutenant. With the escape of the Arabs, the great apes had turned their attention to their fallen comrades. One was dead, but another and the great white ape still breathed. The hairy monsters gathered about these two, grumbling and muttering after the fashion of their kind. Tarzan was the first to regain consciousness. Sitting up, he looked about him. Blood was flowing from a wound in his shoulder. The shock had thrown him down and dazed him, but he was far from dead. Rising slowly to his feet, he let his eyes wander toward the spot where last he had seen the she, who had aroused within his savage breast such strange emotions. "Where is she?" he asked. "The Tarmangani took her away," replied one of the apes. "Who are you who speak the language of the Mangani?" "I am Tarzan," replied the ape-man, "mighty hunter, greatest of fighters. When I roar, the jungle is silent and trembles with terror. I am Tarzan of the apes. I have been away, but now I have come back to my people." "Yes," spoke up an old ape, "he is Tarzan. I know him. It is well that he has come back. Now we shall have good hunting." The other apes came closer and sniffed at the ape-man. Tarzan stood very still, his fangs half bared, and his muscles tense and ready for action, but there was none there to question his right to be with them, and presently the inspection satisfactorily concluded. The apes again returned their attention to the other survivor. He too was but slightly wounded, a bullet grazing his skull, having stunned him, so that when he regained consciousness he was apparently as fit as ever. The apes told Tarzan that they had been traveling toward the east when the scent spoor of the she had attracted them, and they had stalked her. Now they wished to continue upon their interrupted march, but Tarzan preferred to follow the Arabs and take the woman from them. After a considerable argument, it was decided that they should first hunt toward the east for a few days and then return and search for the Arabs, and as time is of little moment to the ape folk, Tarzan acceded to their demands, he himself having reverted to a mental state but little superior to their own. Another circumstance which decided him to postpone pursuit of the Arabs was the painfulness of his wound. It would be better to wait until that had healed before he pitted himself again against the guns of the Tarmangani. And so as Jane Clayton was pushed into her prison hut, and her hands and feet securely bound, her natural protector roamed off toward the east in company with a score of hairy monsters, with whom he rubbed shoulders as familiarly as a few months before he had mingled with his immaculate fellow members of one of London's most select and exclusive clubs. But all the time there lurked in the back of his injured brain a troublesome conviction that he had no business where he was that he should be, for some unaccountable reason, elsewhere and among another sort of creature. Also there was the compelling urge to be upon the scent of the Arabs, undertaking the rescue of the woman who had appealed so strongly to his savage sentiments, though the thought-word which naturally occurred to him in the contemplation of the venture was capture rather than rescue. To him she was as any other jungle she, and he had set his heart upon her as his mate. For an instant, as he had approached closer to her in the clearing where the Arabs had seized her, the subtle aroma which had first aroused his desires in the hut that had imprisoned her had fallen upon his nostrils, and told him that he had found the creature for whom he had developed so sudden and inexplicable a passion. The matter of the pouch of jewels also occupied his thoughts to some extent, so that he found a double urge for his return to the camp of the raiders. He would obtain possession of both his pretty pebbles and the she. Then he would return to the great apes with his new mate and his baubles, and leading his hairy companions into a far wilderness beyond the ken of man, live out his life, hunting and battling among the lower orders after the only manner which he now recollected. He spoke to his fellow apes upon the matter, in an attempt to persuade them to accompany him, but all except Taglat and Chulk refused. The latter was young and strong, endowed with a greater intelligence than his fellows, and therefore the possessor of better developed powers of imagination. To him the expedition savored of adventure, and so appealed strongly. With Taglat there was another incentive, a secret and sinister incentive, which, had Tarzan of the Apes had knowledge of it, would have sent him at the other's throat in jealous rage. Taglat was no longer young, but he was still a formidable beast, mightily muscled, cruel, and because of his greater experience, crafty and cunning. Too, he was of giant proportions, the very weight of his huge bulk serving ofttimes to discount in his favor the superior agility of a younger antagonist. He was of a morose and sullen disposition that marked him even among his frowning fellows, where such characteristics are the rule rather than the exception, and, though Tarzan did not guess it, he hated the ape-man with a ferocity that he was able to hide only because the dominant spirit of the nobler creature had inspired within him a species of dread which was as powerful as it was inexplicable to him. These two, then, were to be Tarzan's companions upon his return to the village of Akhmet Zik. As they set off, the balance of the tribe vouchsafed them but a parting stare, and then resumed the serious business of feeding. Tarzan found difficulty in keeping the minds of his fellows set upon the purpose of their adventure, for the mind of an ape lacks the power of long-sustained concentration. To set out upon a long journey with a definite destination in view is one thing; to remember that purpose and keep it uppermost in one's mind continually is quite another. There are so many things to distract one's attention along the way. Chulk was, at first, for rushing rapidly ahead as though the village of the raiders lay but an hour's march before them instead of several days, but within a few minutes a fallen tree attracted his attention with its suggestion of rich and succulent forage beneath, and when Tarzan, missing him, returned in search, he found Chulk squatting beside the rotting bole, from beneath which he was assiduously engaged in digging out the grubs and beetles, whose kind form a considerable proportion of the diet of the apes. Unless Tarzan desired to fight, there was nothing to do but wait until Chulk had exhausted the storehouse, and this he did only to discover that Taglat was now missing. After a considerable search, he found that worthy gentleman contemplating the sufferings of an injured rodent he had pounced upon. He would sit in apparent indifference, gazing in another direction, while the crippled creature wriggled slowly and painfully away from him, and then, just as his victim felt assured of escape, he would reach out a giant palm and slam it down upon the fugitive. Again and again he repeated this operation until, tiring of the sport, he ended the sufferings of his plaything by devouring it. Such were the exasperating causes of delay which retarded Tarzan's return journey toward the village of Akhmet Zik, but the ape-man was patient, for in his mind was a plan which necessitated the presence of Chulk and Taglat when he should have arrived at his destination. It was not always an easy thing to maintain in the vacillating minds of the anthropoids a sustained interest in their venture. Chulk was wearying of the continued marching and the infrequency and short duration of the rests. He would gladly have abandoned this search for adventure had not Tarzan continually filled his mind with alluring pictures of the great stores of food which were to be found in the village of Tarmangani. Taglat nursed his secret purpose to better advantage than might have been expected of an ape, yet there were times when he, too, would have abandoned the adventure had not Tarzan cajoled him on. It was mid-afternoon of a sultry, tropical day when the keen senses of the three warned them of the proximity of the Arab camp. Stealthily they approached, keeping to the dense tangle of growing things which made concealment easy to their uncanny jungle craft. First came the giant ape-man, his smooth, brown skin glistening with the sweat of exertion in the close, hot confines of the jungle. Behind him crept Chulk and Taglat, grotesque and shaggy caricatures of their godlike leader. Silently they made their way to the edge of the clearing which surrounded the palisade, and here they clambered into the lower branches of a large tree overlooking the village occupied by the enemy, the better to spy upon his goings and comings. A horseman, white burnused, rode out through the gateway of the village. Tarzan, whispering to Chulk and Taglat to remain where they were, swung monkey-like through the trees in the direction of the trail the Arab was riding. From one jungle giant to the next he sped with the rapidity of a squirrel and the silence of a ghost. The Arab rode slowly onward, unconscious of the danger hovering in the trees behind him, the ape-man made a slight detour and increased his speed until he had reached a point upon the trail in advance of the horseman. Here he halted upon a leafy bough which overhung the narrow jungle trail. On came the victim, humming a wild air of the great desert land of the north. Above him poised the savage brute that was today bent upon the destruction of a human life, the same creature who a few months before had occupied his seat in the House of Lords at London, a respected and distinguished member of that august body. The Arab passed beneath the overhanging bough. There was a slight rustling of the leaves above. The horse snorted and plunged as a brown-skinned creature dropped upon its rump. A pair of mighty arms encircled the Arab and he was dragged from his saddle to the trail. 10 minutes later the ape-man, carrying the outer garments of an Arab bundled beneath an arm, rejoined his companions. He exhibited his trophies to them, explaining in low gutturals the details of his exploit. Chalk and Taglat fingered the fabrics, smelled of them, and placing them to their ears tried to listen to them. Then Tarzan led them back through the jungle to the trail, where the three hid themselves and waited. Nor had they long to wait before two of Achmet Zek's blacks, clothed in habiliments similar to their masters, came down the trail on foot, returning to the camp. One moment they were laughing and talking together, the next they lay stretched in death upon the trail, three mighty engines of destruction bending over them. Tarzan removed their outer garments as he had removed those of his first victim, and again retired with Chalk and Taglat to the greater seclusion of the tree they had first selected. Here the ape-man arranged the garments upon his shaggy fellows and himself, until at a distance it might have appeared that three white-robed Arabs squatted silently among the branches of the forest. Until dark they remained where they were, for from his point of vantage Tarzan could view the enclosure within the palisade. He marked the position of the hut in which he had first discovered the scent spoor of the she he sought. He saw the two sentries standing before its doorway, and he located the habitation of Achmet Zek, where something told him he would most likely find the missing pouch and pebbles. Chalk and Taglat were, at first, greatly interested in their wonderful raiment. They fingered the fabric, smelled of it, and regarded each other intently with every mark of satisfaction and pride. Chalk, a humorist in his way, stretched forth a long and hairy arm, and grasping the hood of Taglat's burnous pulled it down over the latter's eyes, extinguishing him, snuffer-like as it were. The older ape, pessimistic by nature, recognized no such thing as humor. Creatures laid their paws upon him for but two things: to search for fleas and to attack. The pulling of the Tarmangani-scented thing about his head and eyes could not be for the performance of the former act, therefore it must be the latter. He was attacked. Chalk had attacked him. With a snarl he was at the other's throat, not even waiting to lift the woolen veil which obscured his vision. Tarzan leaped upon the two, and swaying and toppling upon their insecure perch, the three great beasts tussled and snapped at one another, until the ape-man finally succeeded in separating the enraged anthropoids. As apology is unknown to these savage progenitors of man, an explanation a laborious and usually futile process, Tarzan bridged the dangerous gulf by distracting their attention from their altercation to a consideration of their plans for the immediate future. Accustomed to frequent arguments in which more hair than blood is wasted, the apes speedily forget such trivial encounters, and presently Chalk and Taglat were again squatting in close proximity to each other in peaceful repose, awaiting the moment when the ape-man should lead them into the village of the Tarmangani. It was long after darkness had fallen that Tarzan led his companions from their hiding place in the tree to the ground and around the palisade to the far side of the village. Gathering the skirts of his burnous beneath one arm that his legs might have free action, the ape-man took a short running start and scrambled to the top of the barrier. Fearing lest the apes should rend their garments to shreds in a similar attempt, he had directed them to wait below for him, and himself securely perched upon the summit of the palisade, he unslung his spear and lowered one end of it to Chalk. The ape seized it, and while Tarzan held tightly to the upper end, the anthropoid climbed quickly up the shaft until with one paw he grasped the top of the wall. To scramble then to Tarzan's side was the work of but an instant. In like manner Taglat was conducted to their sides, and a moment later the three dropped silently within the enclosure. Tarzan led them first to the rear of the hut, in which Jane Clayton was confined, where, through the roughly repaired aperture in the wall, he sought with his sensitive nostrils for proof that the she he had come for was within. Chalk and Taglat, their hairy faces pressed close to that of the patrician, sniffed with him. Each caught the scent spoor of the woman within, and each reacted according to his temperament and his habits of thought. It left Chulk indifferent. The she was for Tarzan. All that he desired was to bury his snout in the foodstuffs of the Tarmangani. He had come to eat his fill without labor. Tarzan had told him that that should be his reward, and he was satisfied. But Taglat's wicked, bloodshot eyes narrowed to the realization of the nearing fulfillment of his carefully nursed plan. It is true that sometimes during the several days that had elapsed since they had set out upon their expedition it had been difficult for Taglat to hold his idea uppermost in his mind, and on several occasions he had completely forgotten it, until Tarzan by a chance word had recalled it to him. But for an ape, Taglat had done well. Now, he licked his chops, and he made a sickening, sucking noise with his flabby lips as he drew in his breath. Satisfied that the she was where he had hoped to find her, Tarzan led his apes toward the tent of Achmet Zik. A passing Arab and 2 slaves saw them, but the night was dark and the white burnouses hid the hairy limbs of the apes and the giant figure of their leader, so that the 3, by squatting down as though in conversation, were passed by unsuspected. To the rear of the tent they made their way. Within, Achmet Zik conversed with several of his lieutenants. Without, Tarzan listened,